everybody, welcome to the STOA. My name is Ashley Colby and I'm hosting this series on doomer optimism with my dynamic co-host Jason Snyder. For those of you who are new to the series, doomer optimism is a sort of playful term that emerged amongst a group of us who are experiencing the breakdown of our global consumer society and seeking out alternatives despite the crises we were seeing. So doomer represents the sort of challenges we face, and optimism represents the opportunities that might present themselves to create a new world despite the failure of the current one. Today we welcome guest host Chis Smaje, author of A Small Farm Future, who was our guest in the last session. Chris will interview our main guest speaker today, Dr. Vandana Shiva, an Indian scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty activist or advocate, ecofeminist, and anti-globalization author. One of my personal heroes. Her most recent book is entitled Oneness versus the 1%, and she's been a tireless warrior against the Bill Gates vision of the world. Similarly to Chris, Vandana advocates for local economies, small scale and diverse agriculture, and increase in self-provisioning. And Jason and I thought about how Chris is focused on small farms in Europe. Vandana's activism is with peasant agriculturalists in India and Africa. Jason has his homestead in the United States, and I have my small farm in Uruguay. And between the four of us, we have 5 continents represented in this discussion. So in this session, we were hoping to put forward a doomer optimist vision for an international small farm future collaboration, answering questions like, how can we see our futures as interdependent? How can we fight against corporate and tech interests that seem to want to move peasants from their land? How can we simultaneously acknowledge the challenges put forth by the globalists and thrive despite them? With that intro, I'll hand over hosting duties to Chis Smaje. The session is set to run about 1 hour. Chris and Vandana will have a conversation for about 35 minutes. Jason and I will ask a question or two, and then I'll help to moderate audience questions at the end. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat. I'll be keeping track. If you don't want to be on YouTube, we can read your question on your behalf. And during the chat between Vandana and Chris, I'd like to ask everyone to turn their cameras off so that we can see their images show up in the YouTube video. And I just want to briefly thank Peter Limberg for lending us this platform to have this conversation at the STOA. This is a conversation we hope will plant a seed for an international small farm future collaboration. So with that, I'll invite Chris to get started. And thanks everybody for coming.
Right, well, thanks very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right.
And Chris,
sorry,
just in case you get cut off again, I have your questions, so I can read them.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a moment of panic then when just before we started, my internet dropped out. So if I disappear again, please accept my apologies in advance. But anyway, yeah, good morning or good evening or good afternoon as it is here to everyone. We've got a very international group, and it's a real pleasure and delight for me to be talking with you, Vandana, again on Zoom. We spoke several months ago along with Leah Penniman, and that was a really interesting conversation. So hopefully we can do something similar today. So I think the idea is that I'm going to ask you, Vandana, to share with us some of the benefits of your wisdom and knowledge, and with a few questions before we open it up to everyone, and perhaps I'll pitch in with a few thoughts of my own in response, and yeah, we'll see where we go. But one thing I wanted to open with was, I mean, I guess both of us have written about the need to develop small-scale, local, agrarian, renewable, sort of low-impact societies. And you very often hear that view countered with the notion that nobody in the global north is going to be willing to give up their resource-rich modern lifestyles, and everybody in the global south aspires to that kind of lifestyle. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we counter that kind of narrative.
Oh, Vandana, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. I think this is the heart of the issue, and I have called it chrono-colonization. That the colonizers defines your future. And forces you on it and shuts your present and erases your past. And while over these, 5 decades of my work, I've seen it again and again and again, where the best of societies are bulldozed and removed. Oh, you want this development, and they say, no, we don't want it. We want to stay here in our villages. Not a person I know has left willingly. They have all been forcefully displaced with violence. Just 3 days ago, I was having a debate, very high-level debate, hosted by a group of economists in Paris. And the European Commission was there. Now the lead negotiator for, and special envoy, but the Bank of England governor and the Canadian Reserve Bank governor, and he said exactly what I'm saying now. He says, we are bringing the future to your present. Who are you to determine what our present or our future will be? So the myth that nobody in the North wants to give up their luxuries. I have watched people just run on a treadmill. So many of my own life's changes took place when I went to do my PhD in Canada. And I realized the things I took for granted were so precious. When I went to teach in Sweden, here was my baby growing up with 30 people. And here I was looking after him and then paying a babysitter. And then I realized, no, nobody is choosing this. It's all being imposed. And nobody's choosing it in the South, except the people who are really thrown out of their homes. We did a report on the refugee crisis. Even there, people will not leave their homes unless in Latin America, the gangs take over, the drug cartels take over when their local economy is destroyed. My thesis is you destroy the local economy, you're going to get a criminal economy. And Gorbachev said this once. He and I were at a Future Forum. Gorbachev said, we opened up with perestroika thinking we will get the market and democracy. We got the mafia.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I mean, funnily enough, we just had a farm tour on my little farm here this morning of a bunch of young people. And as we went around and introduced ourselves, almost everyone said that they were, they're learning about agroecology and small scale farming. And all of them pretty much said that they were fed up with doing these terrible, insecure, low paid jobs and feeling that they weren't actually contributing positively to the world. And so we're looking to, to get involved in agroecology as an alternative. So this sort of notion that people are having a great time even in the global north is, as you were saying, is a problematic one, I think. Yeah.
And Chris, let me just add on that I was once in a California university, and I just asked who'd be a farmer if they could. Hall puts up. I was in a debate with Bayer, who said we have to have digital technology and farming without farmers because nobody wants to farm. And I said, why don't we check with this audience, young Berliners? I said, how many of you would farm? Whole Hall puts up their hand. So it's the buyers who say nobody wants to farm. It's the poison cartel who says nobody wants to farm. People say, I want to farm. And the idea that, they left farming so long ago, nobody will learn. You've learned, I've learned, we learn.
And I think it was
this is a learning of joy, unlike so many other skill developments people are pushed into. This is really, we do a course annually, we call it Return to Earth. And for those who are interested, it's in October. And if you go to the Navdanya Earth University, NAVDANYA, it is really, for me, it's really become a daily discovery, and I smile at the nonsense. They're trying to destroy the food system right now. The Gates has hijacked the food summit, taken it from Rome to New York, displaced the one country, one vote democracy of international UN, has appointed his Alliance for the Green Revolution people all over the place, and this fake food push. They're trying to say, no, your food is not good enough, just like your farming is not good enough, leave the land. They say, your food is not good enough, eat the lab food. But the interesting thing is they want to impose on this an IPCC of food with their science, which is not science. It's not science. Making chemicals to kill people and not knowing what they do to insects, it's not science.
Yeah. It was very interesting. I think it was chrono-colonialism, the word you used, is an interesting one, because I think so much of this is about, it's kind of about sort of utopias that are expressed in the medium of time. This notion that small-scale farming is something that people did in the past and is not. I think we need to sort of get beyond that sort of trying to put it in this linear time frame and just think about it in terms of, what are the right ways to live, what are the problems that we are facing now, and and how can we address those in our communities. So I think, yeah, that's a really useful way of thinking about it, I think. I mean, I was going to move on. I mean, maybe this is another way of asking a similar question, but another thing that both you and I have written about is the narrative of global trade and the idea that free trade, sort of opening up borders, and it's always opening up borders to money rather than to people. The flow of people is always regarded as somehow intrinsically problematic in a way that the flow of money isn't. That there's a sort of narrative that this is, that this generates well-being and benefit for everyone. And I mean, perhaps it's interesting to think about that, particularly with me being here in Britain and you in India, because that's always been very much a colonial narrative about the sort of dominant economic powers arguing for free trade. And in your oneness versus the 1% book, you talk a little bit about the idea of Swadeshi in India, and the Swadeshi movement being part of the anti-colonial movement in India. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit, I mean, maybe for people who are not familiar with the idea of Swadeshi, if you could say a little bit about that and where you see, ideas like Swadeshi and localism fitting into a different narrative about economic relationships.
Yeah. So the colonial narrative is that trade began with Britain, which is not at all true. The East India Company, 296 merchant adventurers, got jealous that Columbus had managed to get to Latin America. So they got Queen Elizabeth to write a charter exactly like Columbus's charter. And why did they want India? East India Company, the name tells you they wanted India. They didn't want Timbuktu, they didn't want something else. India, because we were the richest economy of the world on spices and textiles. That was the speciality. Both small scale. Our spice gardens are tiny, and they've stayed the same size over thousands and thousands of years and in the same place. They never destroyed the land. That was truly free trade, in the sense that everyone was free to either export or not export. And it's interesting that because of this trade, people came. I think one of the apostles of one of the early Christians came. So Christianity began first in India and then in Europe. Islam began first in India and then in the Middle East. That was trade, mutual trade, where you choose to trade. And then you say, oh, this is a beautiful religion. And then Islam came here, and our kings and queens started to change. They make it look like they were always invaders. The British created a free trade agreement with the collapsing Mughal Empire. And it was an unequal agreement. It was an unfree trade. No freedom for local traders, all the freedom for the external agent with military defense. That got over, we became independent. And Swadeshi was the word. Swadeshi means making locally. Desh is place, Swa is self. Swadeshi is making locally. Now, the empire of the British was a British empire, was a cotton empire. And the two things Gandhi did was, they wanted to ban us making salt. Gandhi walked to the sea, and nature gives it for free, he said. We need it for our survival. We will continue to make salt. We will not obey your law. That is satyagraha, the force of truth. Swadeshi is, you have colonized us, destroyed our textiles, dumping your industrial textiles on us, catching people as slaves, making us slaves to grow indigo. We will make our own cloth. And making our own cloth then became the spinning wheel. And the spinning wheel became the center of our freedom. And Gandhi didn't know how to spin. There were no spinning wheels around. He found an 80-year-old woman. He said, teach me how to spin, because I want the whole country to spin to freedom, which also is a very good example to say, spinning had died out, spinning wheels had died out. One old woman told one old man, spin. And the whole country started spinning. We brought our textiles back. We were zero in self-sufficiency in the time of British rule. We are 75% making our own cloth, handmade, handspun cloth. And I think it's the same issue for small farms. It doesn't matter that they're being forced to disappear, but it is the future. Because self-making of cloth is important, but self-making of food is even more important, because as we say, we are what we eat. So if we eat poison, we're going to get very sick. If we eat fake food that Gates wants us, and he calls it science. I mean, well, the poison cartel called their poison science, and they have pushed us to poison ourselves. And now this guy wants to poison us even further with GMOs and artificial ingredients and lots of patterns. And he thinks the world is so stupid, they're going to be colonized again. And that's why, for me, the small farm future is the spinning wheel of today. It is the Swadeshi of today.
Yeah. A couple of really interesting points you made there that are very close to my heart is firstly, the issue of choice about, being able to trade when you want to and not when you don't. And that requires being, part of a local economy or a farm economy or a community where, where you have the ability to produce things for yourself and are then able to engage, thoughtfully with other communities and other things that you need, but also that issue of practical competence of actually, the pleasure and the importance of knowing how to spin or how to grow food, rather than the notion that if we have this huge global division of labor that somehow creates a better way of living. So those are really interesting points. I mean, I was wondering if whether you could tell us a bit or reflect on how this fits into, there's sort of quite complex modern narratives around localism and nationalism. I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit. In India, obviously, we know there have been the big farmers' protests recently, and there's in some ways, the Modi regime, as I understand it, is quite signed up to a kind of neoliberal agenda, but in some ways is clothing itself in the appearance of supporting localism and national kind of self-development. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the contradictions of neoliberalism and nationalism.
I think people are very mistaken when they interpret sovereignty as if it resides only at the national level. This is a very recent phenomenon. Nation states are new. Even most kingdoms were very small kingdoms. Empires swallowed up kingdoms. And, because we have a Navdanya International and I'm chair of the International Commission on the Future of Food. I have worked with local governments in Italy. They're called communes. And they have such high levels of autonomy. So many decisions we have made, GMO-free zones, chemical-free zones, begins from that level. So localism is an ecological and ethical imperative. It's an ecological imperative because it's the only scale at which you can really work ecologically. And ethical because it's the only place where you know where you belong. And you belong to the earth. This piece of land is where I am. Hitler turns nationhood into the flag and crushing everyone else. Usually, this is my reading of it, and this is what I think Gandhi's understanding was, and this is what Tagore's understanding was. economic sovereignty, economic freedom, which is the opposite of colonial forced trade. Let's not call it free trade, forced trade, because you force. That system must, by its very nature, destroy the local and take over the national. You know, the colonizer takes over the national, it becomes the sovereign. So Tagore, Gandhi talked about economic sovereignty at the local and the national level. But the national could only grow through local sovereignties. So only a Swadeshi, beginning with, I will spin my cloth. My community will be free of colonialism. And then the nation becomes free. Abstract nation is a modern creation of the West. A belonging, and then coalitions of belonging are ancient times. So we use the word desh, which means place. But we've never met a map, yeah? And there was never a map. Even the word, you know, the word Hindustan is the land beyond the Indus. That's it. The river defined everyone else. And the Westerners were so, you know, they didn't even know that China was there, you know? So for us, we were there and it was the land beyond the Indus. The economic nationalism stands on localism. It must. And it is material. Yeah. It is about the earth. It's about what we eat. Cultural nationalism is anti-local and pro-global. So we should differentiate the cultural nationalism, which is about chauvinism, from economic nationalism, which is about freedom.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sorry, my internet went a little bit unstable then, but I think I got most of that. And I thought it's such an important point you made at the beginning about not mistaking sovereignty for the kind of central sovereignty of the nation state, but sort of seeing it being dispersed, you know, at different levels. And certainly, I think, you know, local politicians are dealing much more imaginatively with kind of real economic and social issues than, you know, we get this rather kind of theatrical politics of, you know, here in Britain, we've had the whole Brexit thing about taking back control or making America great again. All these slogans that you know aren't actually dealing with the you know the sort of practical grounded issues that local politicians are dealing with. But I just wondered if you could say a little more about that. You know, assuming that we do sort of build better localisms that give people more sovereignty and more economic independence. How do you then see people relating to each other? You know, people working within those more local polities and economies. How do we support each other? You know, perhaps particularly between the global north and south, or you know, between different communities to kind of help each other to generate that kind of more positive sense of sovereignty.
Well, I think one of the worst things that's been done by the, you know, you can't separate colonialism and industrialism and this thing they call capitalism, which has no defining contour, except its mythology. Its mythology exists. But you look at the structures, the thinking are the Adam Smiths and the John Locke's, and they're the colonial writers. They're the colonial thinkers. So the theories that we assume came out of some brilliant mind are really practices of militarized, violent colonization. And they have been then distilled into the system we assume to have existed forever and evolved naturally, and it is so sophisticated. You know, we know it's evolved through totally brute force. One of the things that this has done is destroy our sense of interrelatedness. At the scientific level, with the Bacons and others talking about nature is dead, but at the social level, destroying community. People don't realize that 200 years of the enclosures of the commons went hand in hand with invasions into our lands and went hand in hand with the witch hunts that killed 9 million people in Europe. people separate these, and then there's specialists who just look at the tongue, specialists who just look at, but it was all happening at the same time, just match the dates. And it was the same group unleashing terror on the women, on the peasants, on the third world people. Part of what they've resulted in doing was separating us from nature, but separating us from each other and atomizing our sense of who we are. And this has broken community. So the small farm future depends on reclaiming commons and reclaiming community. It's not easy. So the one thing industrialism, colonialism has done is made us careless. It's not an easy carelessness. It's very costly carelessness. It's not nice to be lonely. It's not nice to feel that even your parents aren't there for you or your children aren't there for you. I've watched this again and again. You know, to railway stations, old woman saying, oh, you poor woman, you've got 5 kids. And this woman said, but I love my kids. I love my grandkids. I love them. And after 1 hour of waiting, the woman from the West is crying. And so you're so lucky. You have kids. My kids don't even visit me anymore. And I know when I'm old, I'll be put in an old age home. So this fragmentation has been very costly for human beings, and reclaiming the commons and learning to be community, just like we learn how to do farming, we have to learn to be community and give up our selfishness and give up our fragmentation. But the final issue then is the atomization is what allows our exploitation. Yeah, I've called it the extractive economy, not just extracting from the land, but extracting from society, extracting our labor. I mean, if there's anything Marx wrote about, he was really talking about extraction of the value of your labor. But when you know you're related, the second thing you know is self-organization works. That is Swaraj in my book, Oneness versus 1%. Self-organization is the glue. External control is the necessity and force in an empire. But self-organization and mutuality then allows things to go. And I want to show you just 2 images which I work with. So this is the extractive economy. But when you extract and extract and extract, you get the inverted pyramid. And these are the guys running the food show. Right now, BlackRock, the big financial people, and Microsoft, most people don't realize Microsoft is the big ag player. And then the old players, the Cargills and the Bayers, etc. So you're now on an upside down pyramid, which will topple. It could be wildfires, it could be heat waves, it could be cyclones, it could be anything. But this inverted pyramid cannot stand. An inverted pyramid cannot stand. So we talk of the circular economy. This is the small farm economy. But no circle sits independently. Overlapping circle. Then I want to share with you a very beautiful and very powerful quote of Gandhi's. He says, I do not imagine the world as a pyramid where the top crushes the bottom that supports it. I see the world as composed of innumerable communities in ever widening, never ascending circles. This is the future of solidarity.
Right. Yeah, it's a nice image of ever ascending circles. Well, I think we're running a little bit short on time, but there was I had kind of only really 2 more questions I had, and you kind of touched on both of them. So maybe I'll quickly ask them and you can either answer one or both or whatever. But you were touching just then on issues of gendered violence. And I mean, obviously you've written some pioneering works on ecofeminism, but one argument I encounter a lot when I make the case for small farm societies is that, oh, you know, those societies are bad for women, you know, it's bad to be in the, you know, sort of oppressed in the village, and that the monetized, industrialized economy has opened up opportunities for women. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about, you know, the sort of gendered aspects of small farm societies.
Yeah.
And also you've also been talking about Bill Gates and the kind of philanthro-capitalism, and I just wondered if you want just to say a few more things about that, and perhaps about where you see the best opportunities for activism to counter that kind of you know, Bill Gates philanthro-capitalist kind of narrative.
So the quick thing on the gender issue, in all traditional societies in India, especially if they're tribal, there is no gender hierarchy at all, at all, at all. There might, in some societies, be a division of labor, but they say, oh, but children are always the men's responsibility. Cooking is always the men's responsibility. Up in my mountain villages in the Himalaya, the women work in the fields and the men cook and look after the babies. So this rigid idea of gendered hierarchies is again imposed, like chronocolonization. This is like gender colonization. I was on a jury once of violence against women. And one after the other, these elder women came and gave witness. Their daughter had been killed in new violence. And they said, it wasn't that we could do everything that our husbands could do. There was, some things were our work, some things were their work. But never in our relationships, in all of our lives, and these were 70-year-old women, 80-year-old women talking, never in our lives, in anyone in our community, was there physical violence. We were respected as human beings, different, doing different things. But the most important is I was just doing I was doing a review of a book on femicide. That the more societies atomize people and the more community breaks, the more the man starts to feel more and more insecure. The jobs are gone. The thing is, women never give up working, no matter what the circumstances. They'll do 5 jobs. They'll do 8 jobs, but keep the family going. And then the femicide starts, the killing of women. Femicide is a totally modern, globalized phenomenon. So those who talk about globalization as the liberation of women should just take account of the different forms of increasing violence against women that have never existed in any human society, leave alone small community society. Small farm societies mean community society. And the beauty of villages is, if a husband does get drunk and comes in, that woman is not alone. She's got the whole community to protect her. Whereas if she's in an apartment building, she is alone and will be beaten to death. And talking about Bill Gates, who pretends to be also promoting gender equity, 2015 is the year, I think there was a big shift in world structures. And so much of the structures we see today, which suddenly popped up out of COVID, actually was started there. Gates ran the show in Paris. And I said, UN was supposed to be about United Nations and heads of state. Where did this billionaire come into the picture? And that's why I wrote Oneness versus 1%. And that's my understanding of what changes took place during neoliberal globalization to create this unaccountable wealth. And in addition to the unaccountable wealth, unaccountable power to destroy democracy, to destroy sovereignty, to destroy governance structures. Where are the threats he's posing? There's not a sphere he's left. You looked at COVID, who's telling our governments what to do, when to lock down and when to open up? Who was telling governments to have vaccines when there were no vaccines available? Who has investments in the vaccine and the patents? Dear Bill Gates. So health, WHO, of course he'd taken over. This year is his attempt to take over food and the FAO, as I mentioned. But last year he started with Gates Ag 1. You can read our report on it. One agriculture for the whole world, no diversity. Small farms thrive on diversity. They promote diversity. What Gates is wanting is mega farms, farming without farmers, digital agriculture, drones, and myths about how this is efficient, but it is even more inefficient than the large-scale chemical farms. But I think the 2 other places besides the digitalization is his land grab. He's become the biggest landlord in America. In India, he's trying to get farmers locked into dependence on external inputs, chemicals, but now big data. And he holds the land records. So he will settle the credit bills. And just like in America, land went out of the hands of small farmers after they had trapped the farmers in debt. The disappearance of the small farm is because of debt. With Bill Gates holding the strings on land and holding the strings on the more escalated costs of farming, it will be landlessness, and therefore defense of land is a strategic place. So not just creating new small farms, but defending the existing small farms. And those two struggles have to become one struggle. And finally, the issue of food. He is so hungry to destroy our real food. And we have to defend our real food. So defend the small real farms, defend the real farmer, defend the land, defend the food. That's what we have to do.
Right. Well, thanks, Vandana. Yeah, I'll definitely echo that. Yeah, defending food and defending land. I'm sure there's many more things I'd love to talk with you about, but it's probably time to hand over to Ashley and field a few questions.
Yes, sounds good. I would like to invite everybody to turn their cameras back on, let there be light in the stoa. And the first person I'd like to call on is my dynamic co-host, Jason, in the Doomer Optimist series to ask a question. And then I have a question, and then I will be inviting others who have put their question in the chat to voice their questions themselves if they'd like. So Jason?
Yeah, well, I just like to thank you, Vandana. You know, you're kind of a hero to many of us, and so this is really, you know, an honor to have you. I wanted to talk about theories of change, and you know, a lot of us who are kind of on the same page with regards to need to localize, to move towards agroecology. You know, we see what we've been talking about, the industrial agriculture, the, you know, kind of neoliberal extractive capitalism as kind of too powerful, and the headwinds are too great. What do you, if you were to guess as to, you know, what the pathway towards what we're talking about, is it more about the current systems will just kind of collapse on their own and you know, we need to be ready, or is it more of like we need to be more powerful than the current systems? I don't know if that question makes sense. Like, are we waiting for?
No, I mean, the question makes sense. Of course it does. But I think if there's one thing my thinking has evolved right from the time I did my PhD in Western Ontario in the foundations of quantum theory, which is on non-locality and non-separability, that we live in an interconnected world. And if there's one thing colonialism, industrialism, mechanistic reductionism has done, is fragment, 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 divide, divide, divide. So in an interconnected world, the power of the extractors comes from us. It comes when we give up our, look at the struggles in Canada right now of Indigenous people. They're historic struggles. Yeah, they're very historic struggles. Now their children have been killed in schools and they've been buried, and they're not giving up. They're not giving up. So the first is the power of the colonizer or the extractor doesn't stand independent of the colonized. Sometimes they take power by force, which is what the Indigenous issue is. And sometimes they convince you to give up your power. And the COVID situation is that. The COVID and lockdown is to convince you into a situation where you constantly keep giving up more and more and more. So yeah, you're right. You know, and meantime, I find it fascinating that here's a health problem and it's being answered through digital technology expansion. If it's not safe for children to go to school, let them play at home. Let them play at home. Why are you forcing digital on poor kids? One-fifth of India, places where we had universal education, only 1/5 have parents who can buy a smartphone. Only 1/5 are studying. But for them to destroy the education right for all children doesn't matter, because selling the gadget and the software, and look at the ads. I mean, the Googles and all were all ready with digital teachers. It was all, so, you know, this, for me, it's a total disjunction, because they're two different spheres of life. What's happening to our bodies and what's happening to computers. But they have made the computer the solution to anything that's happening, even where there are multiple other ways to deal with that crisis. So how do we deal with it? Recognize, A, where is our power? B, recognize where we don't give up power. So where is our power is the issue of Swaraj, you know, the self-help, our capacity. What is it that I could, and the discussion on small farm futures is not about a method of producing food. I think that's what Chris is addressing. and what I've been addressing. It's not about food production scale. Get rid of that. It is about what do you live for and how do you live. Now, if what you live for is care for the earth and care for community and a meaning in life, then the only place you can be is the small farm. If the small farm future is vital, then here are all these 5 steps of forcing that are happening. And the people whose land was grabbed in the past must join hands with the people whose land is being grabbed today. People who are traumatized through bad food and have their systems in total collapse should join hands with the small farmers, because food is the continuum. You know, I keep saying food is the currency of life, and I would say food is the solidarity glue. The minute we start organizing around food, you know, I was forced into this field because of the violence. And Bhopal with the pesticide disaster, and Punjab with the difficulties the farmers were facing, and the protests of farmers of India are a continuity from that time. But I realized since that time that if you are organized, you have the right thinking, because the whole edifice is based on fake science, fake fertilizer, fake food, fake power. Don't give up your power. Don't give up your power.
I have my question is directly follow up on that one. So I'm thinking about this idea of doomer optimism that has basically just, you know, emerged itself, you know, that frames this series, and the idea being more or less that the deck is stacked against us. Despite it all, we will find a way to thrive. You know, what other choice is there? What else can we do? But I'm wondering if you have some words of wisdom that can help us all to reclaim our power. You know, how can we light a fire in ourselves? And I'm thinking, I saw you speak, Vandana, at University of Idaho, I think it was like 2010, 2011, and the organizers put a bottle of water on the podium and it was Dasani, and you just didn't drink it. And I refused to drink this product. And I was like, you know, how can we reclaim this power that we have, you know, in every little decision and every big decision, to make the change we want to see?
So, you know, talking about the Dasani, it's women who invited me to Plachimad, and they were fighting Coca-Cola. And then I helped them. And I had them fight till they shut that plant down. But in the process, I understood how violent this bottle of water is. You know, behind every liter is 10 liters of destruction. And mining, every plant of Coca-Cola mines between 1.5 to 2 million liters, which is through theft. And it's leaving thirst. And the women were walking 10 miles. And that's when they called me. And I said, I'll be there. And we shut down the Coca-Cola plant. And I've never been able to even look at that label, Dasani, without having Plachimada come in my head straight away. So how do we take back our power? Every time we get any information from anywhere, any glimpse of the ecological footprint, power comes from responsibility. Most people think power comes from rights. Power comes from responsibility. The minute you're fully aware of what is the right thing to do, you do that right thing. That is power. That is power. And the minute you do the right thing, a whole different sphere starts to change. And it shrinks, you know, shrinks the Coca-Cola space. One footballer, just put the bottles of Coca-Cola away and 4 billion drop, you know, just put the bottle away. Or the other thing on the doomer optimism. So, you know, my PhD is on quantum theory, and there are 3 principles of quantum theory that I think are vital for doomer optimists. Yes, if you project in a linear way the tendencies, whether it's climate change or unemployment or hunger or displacement of farmers or misery or unhappiness, it's all doom, 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 doom. There's no reversal. But the beauty is the world is not linear. That's how we started out. The Chris discussion was this chronocolonization. Time is not linear. Time is not unidirectional. Uncertainty is the reality of the world, and uncertainty means there's always forks. In your life, every moment there's a fork. I can do this or I can do this. In societies, there's a fork. I can go extinct or I can create a future. So the first principle is uncertainty. Second principle is non-separation, interconnectedness. And therefore, every time someone feels, I can't do it, well, you don't have to do it alone. That's the power, you know. What I have learned is, and I've said this often, people think they're all atlases, especially the more committed amongst us. We got to save the world, got to save the world. No, the earth is more powerful than you. All we have to do is be there between the destroyers and polluters and the earth. She'll take care of herself, the rest of it. We are not atlases out to save the earth. We are human beings who are part of the earth to show our love to her. The third principle, which is very, very important, is potential. Because all of this Cartesian thought, all of this colonial thought has made us, blacks are stupid and lazy. Women are secondary. And they just created these categories of inferiority and then essentialized it with theory after theory and books after books after books. No, all of us have potential. And to me, anti-racism is about fighting for your human potential. Indigenous people's fight is about their cultural diversity and their right to land and their potential to be different. So our potential is where our power is. So just throw the rubbish of propaganda out. It might be 500 years of propaganda. It doesn't make it true. Just like 500 years of propaganda doesn't make something true, Bill Gates owning all the media, all the science, all the UN doesn't make his lies true. So just live your life with the passion for life. And out of that will grow everything else.
Thank you. That's so inspiring. I love it. I would like to ask Jacqueline if you're available to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And what an honor to get to ask this question of you, Dr. Shiva. I've been following your work since the violence of the Green Revolution and actually do ongoing research in Ghana on the new Green Revolution in Africa and have a book coming out this summer, or it's out this summer on the subject. So this is a personal question, and it's regarding whether it's appropriate for Indigenous activists to pursue kind of communal forms of intellectual property rights protections as a way to protect against the privatization of seed. And I see this in the case in Ghana, where there is a development of a transgenic cowpea with the donation by Monsanto of the BT gene. And so I wonder what's the way forward for activism regarding this privatization, or does using that kind of discourse and practice of intellectual property rights kind of reinforce that colonial lock-in notion of property?
Well, the first is a patent or intellectual property right is largely granted for inventions, and living material can never be invented. You can add a gene, you know, or you can delete a gene, but the organism itself is not that gene. And, you know, I have learned so much of my own work that the organism exists prior. And if it's traditional varieties, it is the co-creation of nature and the farmer. And that's where we have to develop much more. So we have to develop another paradigm of breeding as participatory breeding. The reason I do not support the intellectual property path is three. First, what I fought against is the very idea of patenting life and patenting seed. And I believed in this ethically and epistemologically, but I've also not just worked with my government to pass laws that say plants, seeds, and animals are not inventions, therefore not patentable. But we have defeated piracy laws. Piracy, you know, again and again and again. I won the neem case, I won the basmati case, I won the wheat case. So challenging the very idea of patenting something that you cannot invent is the legally appropriate way to go. The second is, the minute even a community gets a right, there is another community which might share that resource, and then there'll be conflict. I was invited by Mexico for their Biodiversity Day. And, you know, Mexico has announced corn as their natural heritage. But Gates and some other people, I think in University of California in Davis with Mars bars, you know, those people, I think they've joined hands to pirate a nitrogen-fixing corn. The problem is they dealt with one community and managed to say, oh, yeah, we allow you. And then they gave maybe $1,000 or something I know in cases in Costa Rica, they gave one cow. People are so happy and generous, they're only too happy with this benefit sharing issue. But then there are other communities who have that corn. So this part starts to create conflicts within communities. The third reason why it's not worth it is then you give up the other part, which is reclaiming the commons. And we have huge movements. I mean, in Europe, there's a huge movement. If you read No Patents on Seed and No Patents on Life, very strong movements. We got to strap this. How old is this IPR system? 1995. In America, it's old. But globally, it's TRIPS agreement, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. Why should we allow a 30-year-old error committed by the greedy men to become the norm for us? The norm has to be no patents for life.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I would like to ask Philip to unmute himself if you're available to ask your question.
I already forgot what my question was, so please remind me.
It's people in the global north do not choose but are forced. Still, they also love many aspects of their lifestyles and cannot change on their own. They need incentives, infrastructures, and political leadership. Do you have anything else you want to add besides that comment or add a question to it?
So yeah, well, thank you, Vandana. And I'm living in the global north in America, and I'm mostly working on overconsumption and consumerism, and I know how connected that is to all the things that you're telling us about the global south and the things there. The question is, how do you mobilize the power of consumers to consume differently if they are fragmented, manipulated, etc., etc.? So what can the global north do in order to support your fight for the things you stand for?
Yeah, so again, just like intellectual property rights on seed is a very recent invention, the category of consumer is a very recent invention. The word consumer or consumption was the word for TB during the Middle Ages. You died of it. It was elevated to become our identity when things had to be sold, right? And why was it made into identity? If you have to stop people from growing their food, then they have to be consumers of food. If you have to stop people from having communities and clothing and weaving clothes, then you've got to be consumers of clothes. So my first, I have a book called Making Peace with the Earth, where I've said we have to shift from the identity as consumers to our identity as Earth citizens, number one. Number two, if you have disposable incomes and have the power to shift, don't see yourself as a separate consumer, see yourself as linked to the earth and the one who produced. And the minute you extend your identity to others who made that clothing, or others who grew your food, or the earth that provided that fiber or that food, you suddenly stop being a consumer, you start becoming a co-producer. You realize you have the power to shape patterns of production. Look at the fact that the organic movement has grown even though the policies were junk food. Yeah, people started to make shifts. People started to go for CSAs, say, I will know my farmer. I'll stop being a consumer. I'll be a co-producer with my farmer. Community-supported agriculture. Or look at the damage that the fast fashion industry has done, where they've reached the stage where they're changing fashion by the week, and then they're burning the clothes or dumping it in the oceans. So thoughtful consumption then means thinking about the earth and the producer, and then you start to create what I call circular economies. You start to get to know the people you produce. Either you start becoming a producer yourself, but if you cannot, you become part of a system of a shift. And you then use your disposable income to make that shift. That's the power of a consumer deconsumerizing themselves.
Vandana, we only have 2 minutes left. Do you have time for one more question?
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Evan, I'd like to ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Sure, thanks. Let me pull back up. So my question is basically having to do with the economics of the situation of the globalization movement. So it seems to me that the globalization movement is operating from an economic framing that only makes sense when you're on a war footing, and that the emphasis on like financial instruments, which are basically claims to the future output of other people as wealth, only really makes sense because this is the sort of wealth that you can like take with you and have when you're in a state of total war. The traditional kind of wealth, which is basically conceptualized as improvements to the land that you actually occupy and live on and use to produce, you know, food, agricultural stuff, has basically been erased in terms of the way that we relate to wealth. So do you think that framing sort of makes sense? And if so, then can you speak to why it seems that the globalist elite seems to be operating from an economic frame that only makes sense when you assume a permanent war footing?
Because they engage in permanent war footing. If for them it's not an assumption, it's the reality. If they weren't engaged in war footing, they wouldn't take chemicals of warfare and deploy them by force on all farms. They wouldn't, using chemicals, then displace the small organic farms. They wouldn't, without force and warfare, you know, without declaring a war against our bodies. Gates cannot force feed us with fake food. But he will try to change laws. I know that because the Pepsis tried to change laws. And I had to do satyagrahas with the women and in Gandhi's Ghani to protect our indigenous and local foods. So we can say the global corporate economy is war. Local ecological production systems are making peace with the earth and reaching that. And this generates real wealth. And that is theft. It's the resources of the earth and resources that people create taken through violence as war. So we've got to end the war. We've got to create economies of peace.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up now. I want to thank you, Dr. Shiva, for coming on and inspiring all of us today. I want to thank Chis Smaje for guest hosting so wonderfully and you know, having a real meeting of the minds between the two, you know, giants of the small farm future. I want to advocate that all of you go out and take the fire lit in you today from this talk and make some change. I want to highlight that we have an event coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern time at the Stoa Duggledine of the Dark Mountain. You can register at thestoa.ca. And thanks again for everybody's participation, and have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.